In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to animate using the video timeline feature in Photoshop. And so this is building on the frame animation tutorial. If you haven't watched that video yet, there's a couple things you'll need to do. First, go ahead and create a new file. Just use the default Photoshop settings and change 300 pixels per inch to 72 pixels per inch. Then go up, once that's created, go up to Window and go down to Timeline if your timeline isn't open yet. And once you've got this pane open, the next thing we need to do is change from Create Frame Animation to Create Video Timeline, and then click on the word Create Video Timeline. And now you'll see that we have a very different interface than we had previously. So the video timeline looks significantly different, but what the video timeline does look more like is a traditional non-linear video editing piece of software like Adobe Premiere, even After Effects, Smoke, which is put out by Autodesk. There's a lot of options out there. They all have kind of a similar interface. And so just really quickly, some of the terminology here. This blue object with the red line is called the playhead. And right now it's not going to make any difference because we have nothing drawn on here whatsoever. But we can scroll this forward and backward through this area here. And that's going to advance or rewind where we are in our video. These gray tabs here that I can hover over, this like highlighted gray area is called the work area. So even if I have a video clip that's, in this case, it's 5 seconds long, and I'll show you how I know that in just a second, but right, I can pull the work area in and actually only play a smaller portion of the work area rather than playing the entire thing. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that out. Now, so obviously this is the play button, this is step backwards, this is step forward, and this sends you all the way back to the beginning. Because we're doing GIF animations, which when we finally export this, there's no sound in a GIF animation. And so we're not going to worry about the audio playback. This gear here, this is the settings, and this is really important. There's two things here. First, by default, loop playback is usually not turned on. I would highly suggest turning it on because when you're doing animation, it's good to be able to watch it over and over and over again as you're working on it, because you can see like where something's not working well. So definitely check mark that. And then the resolution, this really depends on the speed of your computer. Currently mine is set to 100%. But what this does is it's anytime it's building preview files, because it doesn't render the video to a final format until you tell it to do that. But it does create these preview files, which can be 100% of the normal resolution, but they take a lot longer to render and a lot longer to play back. And when you're doing something simple, it's not so bad. But when you're doing more complex things, it's not going to be playing back in real time. And so you'll need to set this to 50% or 25%. And so when the video stops playing, you'll get the full resolution. But then whenever it's playing, it's going to be pixelated. All right, so I'm going to set this to 50% just to save myself some time. And then there's just a couple other tools here. This is a way to cut your clips in half, which this is considered a clip. It's a layer, and the purple part here is a clip, which means that it's a short piece of a longer whole, right? And then this allows you to do different transitions, which we'll talk about later. All right, and so on this we have our layer 0, and this is the file. This tells us how long this particular clip is going to play for, right? It's currently the entire length that we've got. Now down at the very bottom of the window, we've got a couple other options. This allows you to switch between frame animation and video timeline mode. Don't use that unless we talk about it and you have a specific reason. It's really obnoxious to go back and forth between the two of them. This allows you to render the video. This frame rate here tells you the frame rate of your timeline, right? Currently, this would be playing back at 30 frames a second. When you're playing the video back, like I'm doing now, it'll either go green or red. If it's red, it'll be a number less than real time, and if it's green, that means it's playing back at it's actually playing back at 30 frames a second. This number here also tells you where you are on the timeline, and it's another way that you can move the playhead back and forth by just clicking and dragging back and forth across here. You can slide forward and backward. And then this slider here, this is your zoom. So it allows you to zoom in on the timeline. Oops, sorry about that. So if I start pulling this out, you'll see that I start to get subdivisions. Now currently, these are the frames, right? So currently I'm seeing full seconds, right? This is 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and 5 seconds. If I keep zooming in, you'll see that I get the 1 second, and then I get this 10F, 20F, and 2 seconds, right? So these are 30, this video is, or this timeline is currently set to 30 frames a second. So this is 10 frames, 20 frames, and then this would be 30 frames or 0 frames, right? So if I continue to zoom in, all the way down, I actually, and I'm going to kick this back to the beginning, I actually have this so far zoomed in that I'm seeing each individual frame now. And you can see that the slider snaps from one frame to another because this is the smallest subdivision possible. All right, so now there's a couple other features here. One of which is at the very far side over here. Most of the time panel menus aren't super important, but here it's really important, right? So the panel menu's here, and we've got several options here, and you'll notice that the frame animation options are totally different than the video timeline options, right? There's several things in here that are going to be really important, but the first thing you always want to do, and I'll say this again and again, especially if you're doing hand-drawn animation or you're modifying each frame manually, is you want to set the timeline frame rate before you do anything else. This is for two reasons. One, if you start drawing, like say you're doing hand-drawn animation, and you draw a second of animation at 30 frames a second, and then you're like, oh, I actually want this to be 15 frames a second. It's just going to eliminate half of your drawings. There are other ways to get around it, but it's a huge headache. It's always best to set the frame rate right from the start. So when you click on that, you get this pop-up, and there's several, you can set it to whatever you want, but these are all standard frame rates, right? So I'm going to suggest that if you're doing hand-drawn animation, you do 15 frames a second, right? If you want it to look really nice and smooth, 24 frames a second would be good. But because of the time we have and the nature of the project, 15 frames a second is ideal. If you end up doing this with modified video, which is one of the options, then the frame rate's going to be 30 frames a second or whatever that default video frame rate is. But in this case, let's do 15 frames a second. We're going to hit OK. All right, now another couple important things. Layer 0 right now, the only layer that we've got that it created by default, is essentially like the background. It's a normal Photoshop layer, which means that it's static, right? Even though it's visible this whole time, you can't animate anything on it, right? You can use this as a backdrop, or if you have some other element that needs to stay still, or maybe there's a photograph, this could be a photograph, it could be anything, as long as it's static, it's not going to change over time. There are a few things you can animate about it, and we're going to go over those. So if we look at layer 0 here, if we flip open this drop-down menu, this opens up some of our options. And the way that you animate things on the video timeline and with any nonlinear video editing software is to create what are called keyframes. And keyframes are moments in time where you set a particular setting. Say, let's start with opacity. And we'll just use this as a demo for what this does. So I'm going to draw something on this background. It doesn't matter what it is. You can draw whatever you feel like. drawing. I'm going to make a really angry little face here. Now I do have this blown up really large. The reason that's so pixelated is because I am, oh, there we go. Here's a big grumpy face, right? Okay, so I've got my big grumpy face drawn. Now, the reason it's pixelated is because it's zoomed in 244%, right? So what this looks like at 100%, it's going to be about this size. Okay, so let me hit Command 0 or Control 0, get back here. So now we're going to go ahead and animate the opacity on this. And so to do that, I'm going to zoom in so you can see what I'm doing. There's these little stopwatch icons. In order to turn on or off keyframes for a particular one of these options, you need to click once on the stopwatch. And that's going to, wherever your playhead is when you do that, it's going to set a keyframe. So if I turn this off, pull this over to frame 6, and turn on opacity, it's going to set a keyframe, this golden diamond, at frame 6. Now, something else to note, when I turn off the opacity, if I turn this off, any keyframes that I've made, any settings that I've made disappear, right? They're gone unless I undo that action. So this isn't like visibility of a layer. You can't turn it on and off and have everything remain the same. This needs to remain on if you're going to keep the settings that you have. So I've turned this on, I've created a keyframe at frame 0, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so I can get this. And then I'm going to zoom down here just a touch to make this a little bit easier. And I'm going to go out to 1 second, and I'm going to create a new keyframe. And the way to create a new keyframe is to click on this gray arrow diamond here. Right? And now that I've created 2 keyframes and I've got this one's highlighted in gold, that means it's the keyframe that's selected. If I click on these gray arrows, it's going to jump the playhead back, right, to whichever one I've got it set on. If I click on this arrow now, I can also remove an individual keyframe. You can also just hit the delete key on the keyboard to get rid of a keyframe as well. All right, so I've got 1, 2, and then I'm going to come back out to 2 seconds, and I'm going to create a 3rd keyframe. Now that I've got those keyframes set, I'm going to move my playhead back to the center one. I'm going to click on it to make sure it's selected. And then I'm going to come over, because we're controlling opacity, we control the opacity of the layer we're working on in the same place we would with a static image. We come over to opacity, draw this down to 50. I'm going to draw this down to 20%, something like that. Okay. And so now if I zoom back out, you'll see the face is at 20%. However, if I move my playhead back and forth, you'll see that it goes from being transparent to being opaque. Right? So now if I play this, you'll see that it zooms in and out, and then there's all this space that I haven't done anything before it loops again. What would be useful is if I'm working on this section of the video and I only want to deal with that section of the video, is if I could pull this workhead over so that this is the only spot that'll play back. So I'm just going to pull this gray tab over, and now, right, I'm working on this, and so it's just going to repeat that section of the video. Now you can also use this if you have a longer video and you decide you just want a small portion of it. When you export it, you can actually export just the work area, which we'll talk about later as well. Okay, so right, I'm using keyframes. I'm able to animate the opacity of this face. You can also animate position, right, with a static layer. So I can move this thing around, I just can't change it in any other way. So if I can't rotate it, there's a lot of stuff I can't do with it right now. But so if I start it here, and then maybe at this point, it moves up over here for some reason, right? So over time, and you'll notice it moves in a straight line between those 2 points. If you want to have it move in a curve, you have to go through and set more keyframes in between these two to get it to take the shape of that curve. All right, so I've moved this thing over here, and then it's currently staying over there for the rest of the animation. Something else you can do, say you have all of your settings on this keyframe that you like, and you want the face to return to that keyframe or to those settings by the end of this video. What you can do is you can pull your playhead over, create a keyframe, and then zoom in, click on your first keyframe, right click, copy it, click on this final keyframe and paste it. And so what that will do is it'll take your position from this keyframe and copy it to this other one. That can save you some time, especially if you're making something that oscillates or moves backward and forward, right? Rather than having to move it back and forth manually, you can actually copy those settings to do the same thing. Okay, so now I've got this grumpy face that fades in and out and moves side to side. Very exciting. So these are the things you can do with a standard layer. Now style, we haven't talked about layer styles, but basically you can go down and there's all these different effects like inner glow and gradient overlay, etc., etc. All of these things that you can also animate over time with keyframes. You can experiment with that, like adding a drop shadow and having it disappear or change. But those are the few things you can do with one of these standard layers. So now I'm going to create another type of layer. Let's go ahead and just get rid of all of these position and opacity keyframes. And actually, I want to go ahead and I'm going to create a background just like I did in the frame animation. So I'm going to use the gradient tool, make sure I have the chrome gradient selected. You could try something else. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Maybe this will be gorgeous for the background, right? And then I'm going to just pull this down and I'll just cover up this grumpy face. Maybe I'll do a different gradient. We'll just do orange and purple. That sounds great. Okay, so I've got my background, right? This is just a background. I could come in here with my brush and I could, you know, draw a happy little tree, right? Little tree. You know, maybe make a little crappy mountain back here, something like that. Oh, it's so beautiful. Okay, so anyway, and maybe I'll draw a horizon line here somewhere like that. All right, so I've got my crappy little background. Now I need to create, what I'm going to do is I want to do hand-drawn animation. I want to be able to animate a hand-drawn ball or something falling out of the sky and bouncing on the ground. So to do that, I need to create a special type of layer. And the only place I can create that layer is by going up to the top of the screen, going to the layer menu, and going down to video layers and creating a new blank video layer. Now you'll notice when I create this that it has a little film strip icon in the corner, right, to differentiate it from a standard layer. It's also blue in color rather than purple in color, right? So in this timeline, anything purple is static, anything blue is a video layer. And if I open this up, I have one more option that I can control, which is altered video. And altered video, if I zoom way in, is where I can draw on a single frame at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this a different color than the background just so it stands out. And it looks like green's going to be my best option for contrast. So I'm going to have this green ball start here. Right? And it's just going to be an outline this time because we're hand drawing and it's going to take forever if I fill that in. So I've drawn this green ball and now I'm going to slide my playhead over one frame and the green ball disappears. And I also get this gray area here. This means this frame has been altered, right? There is an image there, right? And so if I slide this back and forth, you can see that, right, it disappears. Now, I could hope and pray that I knew exactly where that circle was before it disappeared. But Photoshop has a feature called onion skinning that's built in that allows us to see the previous frame and the the current frame, the previous frame, and if we have another frame on the other side, the following frame. So if I come in here, I can go down in this panel menu for the timeline. I can go down to Enable Onion Skins, and I can check mark that. Now you'll notice that when I do that, this image gets significantly darker. And that's because the way that onion skinning works is it makes the layers 50% opaque and turns them into multiply, right? It uses the blending mode multiply, right? Which makes, because they're just stacking on top of each other, it makes the images darker and darker and darker. If you want to change that, like in this case, I can barely see that circle. If you want to change that, you can go down to Onion Skin Settings, and you can either change how many frames are before or after, the maximum opacity, the minimum opacity, and the blend mode. And say screen, here we go. In this case, screen is going to be my best option, right? Normal didn't really make any difference whatsoever. So I'm going to use screen. You'll notice everything's totally different in color. I can also have more than one frame before and after, but currently I'm just going to leave it set to 1. So now to animate this, I can just come down here. I can draw another circle about the same size on my current frame, pull it over, come over here, right? Draw another circle on this frame, and I can keep doing that forever and ever. Now, something that's going to speed your time up, because if you're drawing a circle, moving the playhead over, drawing a circle, moving the playhead over, that's going to take a lot of time. And when you're animating, it just takes a lot of time to do anyway. So any time we can speed the process up, we want to. If we come down here to our to this menu, you'll see that there's this option to enable timeline shortcut keys. I don't know if that is enabled by default or not. But what it does is it changes some of the shortcuts to make this process much faster. One of the ones that's really important is that the arrow keys, the left and right arrow keys, become forward and back on the timeline, right? So if I'm just clicking forward and backward on the timeline, and I'm able to move through this. So now I'm on the current frame that has nothing drawn on it. So I'm going to go ahead and draw another frame. I'm going to come down here, I'm going to draw another one, and I'm just going to keep going until I get to wherever I think this is going to hit the ground. And I'm going to say it's probably going to hit the ground right about here. So I'm going to start flattening it a little bit more. A little bit more. All right, and then I'm going to start coming back up. And because this is hand drawn and the way I'm doing it, I wouldn't really want it to be perfect, right? So I'm not going to copy those frames. I'm just going to Okay, so now before I go ahead and test this animation that I've done, I've got to do two things. First, I'm going to turn the onion skinning off temporarily so that I can get what this really looks like, and then I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to grab the work head, and I'm going to pull this over until it only matches the area that I've actually edited. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit play, right? And there's my ball bouncing on the ground, dropping out of the air, and bouncing off to the side of the screen. If I go to settings and make this resolution 100%, this is pretty simple. It might play back in full time. Oh, absolutely, right? So I can kind of see what this ball's looking like. Now, when you're animating, when you're doing hand-drawn animation, it's good to draw outlines or stick figures first, right? You want to make sure that you're not wasting all your time drawing a frame and then realize you have to make that the motion isn't right and you have to fix something. It's best to quickly sketch out the motion, get that set, and then use those lines, create another video layer, and do your fine-tuned drawing on top of that video layer. Now, let's say that I really want this ball to flatten out more once it gets down there. So this is the frame where it is flattest. I'm going to go ahead and turn onion skinning back on. I'm going to zoom in more so I'm definitely know which frame I'm on. And so let's say I want it to squish even more than it already has. The way that I can add a frame is I can go up to Layer at the top of the screen, go down to Video Layers, and I can either insert a blank frame, duplicate a frame, or delete a frame. Right? And so I am going to go ahead and I'll just insert a blank frame. Now, once I've done that, you'll see that I have, this is the previous frame, and this is the next frame in the lineup. I probably actually wanted to go maybe one the other direction, but it's fine. I'm just going to draw this thing in here. So I want this to really flatten out. So I'm just going to come in here and smush it a little bit more, and then I'll hit play. Now you see I've got my keyframes on, so let me go ahead and turn those off real quick. Sorry, not my keyframes, my onion skins. Right. Okay, so I'm squishing this thing, it's bouncing, it's squishing way out wide. Now, at this point, I could still manipulate the position. I could have this whole animation that's happening slide across the screen, right? So like if I do a hand-drawn animation of a person walking, right? So it's their walk cycle, they're taking steps. Even if I have them animating in a single place, I can actually have that animation start on one side of the screen and then have a keyframe here for the position, have a keyframe over here at the end of the animation for their position, and have them walk across the screen. And I could also animate the style. So as an example with style, because we just haven't done it before, I'm going to go down to FX, and I'm just going to do a drop shadow. Oops, I think I did outer glow instead. Let's see what that looks like. Ooh, that actually kind of works. All right, so we're going to do outer glow, and we're going to screen this. We'll make the opacity 35%. We'll make the spread maybe we'll make the size a little bit bigger. There we go. So this is glowing. We could change some other things. I'm going to hit OK. All right, and I'm going to pull my playhead back to frame 1. All right, even with this style on, right? Now I've got this glowing thing happening here. I'm going to go back to the first frame. I'm going to set a keyframe for the style, and then I'm going to come over maybe a second in. I'm going to create another keyframe. And you'll notice that over here I've got these effects and outer glow. If I double click on outer glow, then I can come in here and I can change some of these settings. So I'm going to change the color from white to teal. And maybe I'll make the spread a little bit bigger. Maybe I need a color that's a little bit stronger than that. Let's see if I can make magenta is probably going to work pretty well. There we go. And maybe instead of, well, we'll leave it at screen. And I'll make the opacity a little bit heavier, right? So it really stands out. And hit OK. And so now you can see that I've actually changed this. So it starts out at white, and it slowly gets bigger and harder, and then changes to this bright magenta outline. So that's one of the ways that you can, these are some of the features you can animate, right? So I can actually animate the settings of those effects over time, which is really awesome. But there's still a few things that we need to introduce and a few ways of animating in this mode that I would like to talk about in this initial video. And so one thing I'm going to need you to do is download a file and open it up. Okay, so I'm going to open this video timeline demo.psd file. And currently, this is just a standard image file. It's a poster from World War I that I got off the Library of Congress website. So we're going to go ahead and create a video timeline. which you should already have open. Once you open this panel, once you click on it, it's going to be even if you're working on static images, it'll still show up. You can always go in here and go down to close tab group and it'll disappear. All right, so I'm going to create a video timeline. So now I've got my single layer in there, right? This is a static image. It's going to serve as my background. And what I need to do is I need to select a couple elements that I want to animate. So I'm going to select one of these kids' heads. And to do that, I'm going to use the magnetic lasso tool. I'm going to zoom in so I can see his face nice and clearly. And I'm just going to click here and just start drawing. And remember, if you have a hard corner, you could just click, you just set your mouse on the hard corner and click, and the tool will make a sharp turn. Like right here, click, pull this around. And you'll see that his chin is not getting selected, that line, which I want to have selected. So I'm going to use the lasso tool to add on to my selection area. Just click and drag here just to finish that off. And make sure I have his whole face and all of those outlines taken. And then I could grow the selection area 1 pixel or something like that, but I'm fine with how it is. No, I'm not. I'm lying. I'm going to go ahead and grow it. Under Select, you can go to Modify and Expand. And I'm just going to expand it by 1 pixel, maybe 2 pixels will be enough. Right, and so that's that was actually probably too much. I'm going to undo that. I'm going to go back down to Modify, Expand, and just say 1 pixel. All right, and so now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste his head into a new layer. All right, so now I've got the background, which I can turn off and on. It's given me a background as well, which I don't really need. And I've got his head floating here. Okay, so what do I want to do with his head? I'd like to do several things. However, the way this is set up, currently all I can do with his head is I can change the position, the opacity, and the style. I don't really want his head to disappear, right? And I actually still have his whole head on the first layer. I could select that and delete it and just have the background have no head on him whatsoever. Maybe I want to change the position, right? Maybe I want his head to bob a little bit, right? So I'm going to go, and I'm just going to do this at the second marks so it's nice and slow and easy to follow. So I'm going to create, and I'm actually going to create 3 keyframes. I found that it's really quick to, if you have a plan in mind, like what you want the motion to look like let's say I want his head to bob down just a little bit in the center of this animation. If I know that this is the head position I want, just creating 2 keyframes on either side of the point that I'm going to manipulate beforehand means I don't have to copy any settings over. These 3 points currently are all identical in their settings, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the playhead to the center setting, to the center keyframe, and then I'm going to use my move tool to pull his head down a little bit. Right, now there's going to be his other head is going to show up, and that's fine because we're just doing this as a quick demonstration. And so I'm going to pull the work area over to 2 seconds so I just see the spot I'm working on. And you can see his little head's bobbing now. Right? Okay, so I'm actually going to turn his head off as far as visibility is concerned, and I am going to use the selection tool. I'm going to select his little head here. I'm going to try and delete it. I'm going to right click on this. Oh, why can't I do fill? Oh, I'm on the wrong layer. So I need to click on layer 1, right click, fill, content aware, okay. Now, it got rid of most of his head, but it kind of filled in his neck some. If I was going to really do this, I'd probably use the rubber stamp tool, the clone stamp tool, sorry, to get rid of some of that. But instead, I'm just going to deselect this area by hitting Command or Control D. And now, I mean, I know his head is going to, when it bobs, I shouldn't see that weirdness that's going on there. All right, so you can see there's his head bobbing bobbing along as he walks. Right? So what if I want to do other things to his head? What if I want his head to swell up like a big balloon and then deflate again? Right? So in other words, scale his head in the center. There's no option to do that. If I go and click Show Transform Controls and make sure I have selected layer 2, right, and I hold down Shift and Option and I scale his head up, his head is going to be, and then double click it, because you'll notice you won't be able to do anything unless you set this transform. Right? So now his head's still bobbing, but it's big all the time. So I'm going to undo that. All right, so his head's normal scale, still bobbing. All right, so I've got this to bob, but I'm not getting it to do much else. And so what I need to do is I need to turn this into a smart object. Because for whatever reason, the way Photoshop works, you can't rotate or get any wiggle or bobs or any scaling things happening without turning this object into a smart object. And before, when we worked with smart objects, we just opened an already existing file in our Photoshop document as a smart object, and it was happy. To create a smart object from an existing layer, you right-click on the layer in the Layers panel and go down to Convert to Smart Object. You can also go up to Layer at the top of the screen, and I believe that's where you can also convert it to a smart object. If you haven't already done that and the option disappears or turns off. Nope, you can do it here. Okay, so go to Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Objects. All right, so now this is a smart object. Now, what that means is any animation that I did in this layer transfers with it, right? So if I open this up, you'll see that I have no keyframe set. I have nothing animated yet. But if I hit play, right, my little character's head is bobbing up and down. And that's because the layer that I turned into a smart object was a video layer and had keyframes on it. So this is kind of a way you can do nested animations. So now his head's bobbing. That's wonderful. I'm going to go ahead, and you'll notice that now down here, rather than position being the top one, transform is the top keyframe option. So I'm going to turn transform on. I'm going to create a keyframe here. I'm going to go down to keyframe. I'm going to go down to 1 second, add another keyframe, go to 2 seconds, and add a third keyframe. And then with this center keyframe selected, I am going to hold down Shift and Option, and I'm going to scale his head up. Now, the issue is that when I went to do that, you'll notice that this is the object, but as soon as I go to modify it, it expands to be the entire page. And that's because these are the borders of the smart object that we're working with. I don't know why it does this. I don't know why they can't get it to constrain around the object that you're working on. But unfortunately, this is the way it all functions. So the first thing I want to do, if I want to expand, keep his head in the same position and grow it in size, I'm going to need to take this central anchor point here and drag it somewhere in the center of his face, and then come up here to the outside edge and hold down Shift and Option and expand his head. And then double click on it. Okay, so now if I hit play, right, so now his head's growing and shrinking. Right? Pulsating big head. Okay, so now when it's at its largest, I'd also like to have it up a little bit higher than it is. So if I click on this and move it up, say to where it should be, right? Transform also controls position, right? It doesn't just control how things are angled, but it also controls where they are on the screen. So if I pause this one more time, I can also get some wiggle into his head now, right? So I can say, but in this keyframe, I want his head to rotate a little bit like this. And then in this end keyframe, I want his head to rotate a little bit like this. Now, the whole thing is moving as well, so I'm going to pull this back over to to here and double click. All right, and so now if I play this, right, his head, and it flips back, right? What I really want is I want that rotation to be the same on the first frame and the last frame. So if I pause this, right click on this keyframe and copy, right click on this keyframe and paste, oops, drag my playhead over. Did you see what just happened? Right, even though I clicked on this one and hit paste, it actually dropped a new keyframe where my playhead was, and which is not what we want, because then in 3 or 4 frames his head inflates, right? Which maybe with what you're doing might be good, but I'm going to delete that keyframe, move my playhead over here, right click and paste this option, right? And then in the center one, I'm actually going to click on this. I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to rotate his head a little bit. Now, before I do that, I'm actually going to grab this center point, put it somewhere on his neck, or where his neck's hidden by his big face. And I'm actually going to rotate this pretty far back so it makes a big change. It's easily visible. So now Command 0 to get closer, and I'm going to hit play. Right, so now I've got his head growing, rotating, and moving slightly as all of that happens. Right? And I can still deal with opacity. I can still apply a style to this and animate that style. But by using a smart object, I'm able to make this change. Now, if for some reason I want the little bopping and hopping to stop, which it pretty much has because of the way I'm working with the animation, I can always double click on the layer that is the smart object. And I can come down here and edit these keyframes, right? So in this animation, right, his head's moving just a little bit. I could delete those, I could change them in some way, and then they'd be applied in my final document. So those are the basics of editing video files or animation files using the video timeline. The next video tutorial about the video timeline is actually going to be showing you how to open video files and edit video files in Photoshop.